Appreciate you joining us for a little bit of our daily bread today. We are in 1 Corinthians chapter 14. 1 Corinthians 14, we're going to be looking in verses 26 through 36 today, if you'd like to follow along with us. Verse 26, how is it then, brethren, whenever you come together, each of you has a psalm, has a teaching, has a tongue, has a revelation, has an interpretation? Let all things be done for edification. If anyone speaks in a tongue, let there be two or at the most three, each in turn, and let one interpret. But if there is no interpreter, let him keep silent in church, and let him speak to himself and to God. Let two or three prophets speak, and let the others judge. But if anything is revealed to another who sits by, let the first keep silent. For you can all prophesy one by one, that all may learn and all may be encouraged. And the spirits of the prophets are subject to the prophets. For God is not the author of confusion, but of peace, as in all the churches of the saints. Let your women keep silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but they are to be submissive, as the law also says. And if they want to learn something, let them ask their own husbands at home, for it is shameful for women to speak in church. Or did the word of God come originally from you, or was it you only that it reached? I mentioned yesterday we're going to be looking at 5 key words throughout 1 Corinthians 14 this week. Yesterday we looked at the word edification, and I think that's the big key word in 1 Corinthians 14. The word we're going to be looking at today is self-control. And that passage that we just read, it jumped out at me last night when I was looking at it, just how much self-control the Corinthians were being called on to exhibit. Because you can tell Corinth it's pretty chaotic. When he says, when you come together, each of you has a song, has a revelation, it's just chaos. And God is not the author of chaos. God is the author of peace. So they're being called on to exhibit a good bit of self-control. So that passage that we just read, what we're going to see, and let's just get into it. The first point is that there were those there who needed to be quiet. Look back at the passage. Verse 27, if anyone speaks in a tongue, let there be 2 or at the most 3, each in turn, and let one interpret. Now, you can tell verse 26, like I said, it's chaos at this point, and things are not being done for edification. So in order for things to be done for edification, you have verse 27. If anyone speaks in tongue, let there be 2 or at the most 3. Okay, well, what if there's 4 people who have the gift of speaking in tongues? What if there's 4? What's that 4th person going to have to do? They're going to have to be quiet. And it says, and each in turn. So while the other one is speaking, and someone is interpreting, by the way, we'll talk about that here in a second, each in turn. So that means while the other one is speaking, what are the other 2 going to have to do? You're going to have to be quiet. Now that's going to take some self-control. Sometimes we just talk too much. Sometimes we just talk too much, and I'll certainly include myself. Sometimes I just talk too much. And you know what I need to do? I need to shut up. To put it bluntly, I need to be quiet. We all probably could learn this lesson, but I'll just speak for myself. These folks here, they needed to be quiet. Verse 27. That 4th fella, or while the others are talking, you need to be quiet. The second point is there's others, though, who need to be quiet. Look back at the passage. Verse 28. If there's no interpreter, let him keep silent in the church, and let him speak to himself and to God. So certainly, that's the case. The back half, let him speak to himself and to God. But in the church, let him keep silent. If there's no one to interpret at this time, get it back up on the screen. I don't know where it goes sometimes. You're going to have to keep silent. If there's nobody to interpret, if the person who has that gift, if they're sick and they're not there that Sunday in Corinth, what are you going to have to do? Well, I'll just go ahead and throw it out there. No. That's not edifying. It has to be interpreted. Here in Corinth, it had to be interpreted. This is how this gift is going to work, so that all can be edified. Let him keep silent in the church if there's no interpreter. That's going to take an immense amount of self-control. You're in Corinth and you have the gift of speaking in tongues. And you think that's the cat's pajamas right there. You got the gift of speaking in tongues, and all of a sudden Paul says, if there's nobody to interpret, that you need to shut your mouth. That's going to require an immense amount of self-control. You're going to need to be quiet. Our third point is you're going to need to be quiet. I know. It's kind of obvious where this is going, isn't it? Look back over at verse 30. But if anything is revealed to another who sits by, let the first keep silent. And this is talking about the prophets. Let 2 or 3 prophets speak, and let the others judge. But if anything is revealed to another who sits by, let the first keep silent. I know it's talking about the same thing as the tongues. If someone else is talking, you be quiet. If anything is revealed to another who sits by, let the first keep silent. You can all prophesy one by one, that all may learn and be encouraged. As an application for that, sometimes in Bible classes, people just start talking, and they start talking over one another, and no one can follow it at that point, and people are not being encouraged. They're not being encouraged because they're not being edified, because they're not able to hear it and understand it. And what folks need to do is like what those folks in Corinth need to do. They need to be quiet. If someone else is talking, if something with the prophesying that was happening, if something's revealed to someone else, the other one's going to need to be quiet. How much self-control is that going to take if you have the gift of prophecy? That's going to take an immense amount of self-control to be quiet when you have that gift. You want to guess what the fourth point is today? It's be quiet. Verse 34. Let your women keep silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but they are to be submissive, as the law also says. For one thing, we know from other passages that we're talking about women having authority, is what we're talking about. Doesn't mean that women cannot sing. That's not what that means. It does not mean mute, for one thing. That's not what it means. But what was happening was you had women who were usurping, and they were not being submissive. I mentioned in chapter 11, that's one reason that some folks think that the veil was so important as a sign of submission. Because what you had was you did not just have men who had these gifts, you had women who had these gifts too. Well, if you're a woman who has the gift of speaking in tongues or prophesying, well, that's going to be for the edification of the church. Are they not going to be? So the question is, okay, how could they speak in the church, given what this passage says in 1 Corinthians 14? So some folks think, and I don't think it's a bad idea here, in thinking about perhaps that's why the veil was commanded. Perhaps. We won't rehash chapter 11. We'll simply look to this verse and recognize this truth. Let your women keep silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak. They are to be submissive, as the law also says. If they want to learn something, let them ask their husbands at home. For it is shameful for women to speak in church. It says what it says. How much self-control does that take? And I understand I'm a man asking that. But how much self-control does that take? To swallow, and one reason I wanted to have this brief study that we're having. How much self-control is that going to take if you have the gift of speaking in tongues? How much self-control is that going to take if you have the gift of prophecy? How much self-control is that going to take if you're a woman? How much self-control does it take for things to be done decently and in order in the Lord's eyes? It takes self-control. It takes humility. It takes discipline. But if we're going to be pleasing to the Lord, and if we're going to do things like He wants us to, in order that He may be glorified and others may be edified, then sometimes we're going to have to be quiet. There's a time to speak, but there's a time not to speak as well. And it takes a lot of self-control to not speak and to be quiet. So it's discipline. It takes discipline. I hope this brief study's been helpful for you. Hope you have a good day. I appreciate you tuning in, and I hope to see you tomorrow. Thanks for being with us today.